welcome back to Discover the Wonders. Today we are talking about Moses, God calling Moses to do a very important and a hard job, and also a story about somebody else who was also called by God to go to China. So these are two very special stories, and through these stories, especially the one about the man who went to China, we see the wonder of prayer, the wonder of a God who answers prayers and also who provides and takes care of his children. So let's start with Moses. So last week we continued the story of Moses and how he was adopted into the princess's family. He became the princess's own daughter and he grew up in the palace after a few years of living with his own family. But then he got into trouble when he tried to help his own people, the Israelites, and then he had to run for his life and leave the palace. And he went to Midian and he ended up becoming a shepherd and looking after Jethro's sheep. And there he married one of Jethro's daughters. So now he is a shepherd in Midian looking after sheep, plain old shepherd, not a prince anymore. And he had wanted to help his people, the Israelites, and the way things had turned out, he couldn't after all. But God's not finished with Moses yet, and God does care about the Israelite people, and God is going to rescue them. So one day, Moses is just doing his job, working away as a shepherd, looking after his sheep, when he sees something very unusual. So, first of all, he sees a bush that's on fire. Now, if you're out in the desert and you see a bush on fire, that's a bit scary because that could spread and have, wild bushfires. And so he looked at it, but as he looked at it, he saw that the bush didn't burn up, didn't spread. It was just on fire, but it wasn't really properly burning. And he thought, what on earth? And so he went closer to have a look. And then he heard a voice coming from the fire. And he knew that it was God speaking to him. So God had made this bush on fire to catch Moses' attention so Moses would stop to have a look. And God said, Moses, take your shoes off. You are on holy ground. So Moses did what God said. He took his shoes off and then he listened to see what God was going to say. And God said, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I have heard the cries and the groans of your people, the Israelites in Egypt. I have heard, and I've seen the way they've been treated, and I know their sorrows. I know all the things they have to go through there, and I am going to rescue them. Now, Moses, I want you to go into Egypt and to bring all the Israelites out. Now, this is what Moses had wanted to do years ago when he was back in Egypt, but his way of doing it didn't work. He had to run for his life, and now God is saying, I want you to go back, go to the king, ask him to let the Israelite people go, and bring them out. Now, Moses is not so keen anymore. He doesn't think he can. And so Moses is full of excuses and reasons why he shouldn't go. And he said, but I can't do that. I'm just a nobody. I'm nobody important. I'm just a shepherd. And God said, I know you're a nobody, but I will be with you. You may be a nobody, but if you've got God with you, you've got all you need. But Moses said, but I don't know what to say. What do I say to the king? And God said to him, I will tell you what to say. But Moses said, but they won't listen. They won't listen to me. The king won't listen to me. The Israelites won't listen to me. And God said to him, that is my job. I will take care of that. And God gave him two very special miracles. First, he said, Moses, get your shepherd stick and throw it on the ground. And so Moses did that. And when he did that, his stick became a snake. And Moses got a fright and moved back. And God said, Moses, pick up the snake. And so Moses picked it up, and when he grabbed it, it turned back into a stick again. And God said, Moses, if the people won't listen to you, if they won't believe you, do this, and they will see that I have sent you. And then he gave him a second one, a second miracle. He said, Moses, put your hand into your coat, into your cloak. And so Moses did that, and God said, pull it out again. And when Moses pulled his hand back out, it was covered in leprosy, the dreaded disease of leprosy. And then God said, put it back into your clothes again. And when Moses did that, and then he pulled out his hand was clean again. So that was the second miracle God gave Moses. If people weren't going to listen to him, that's what he could do to show them that God had sent him. Now, so Moses is going to have God with him. God is going to tell him what to say. God is going to help the people to listen and believe him. But Moses still wasn't convinced. He said, but I can't talk very good. I'm not good at talking. I'm not a good speaker. And God said, who made your mouth, Moses? I made your mouth, and I'm calling you to do it. But I will help you. I will be with your mouth, and I will help you. And then Moses said, can't you just send somebody else? And God said, no, Moses, I want you to go. Well, actually, God said, your brother Aaron, your big brother Aaron, he could go with you, and he could do the talking for you. But you know what? God still wanted Moses to go. Moses was who God had chosen to go, and Moses was not keen at all. It felt like such a hard job. And remember, he'd come away from there like running away, and now God wants him to go back and do the difficult job of bringing the people out. But you know, he can't just go and get them. He's got to try to convince the king to let his slaves go. This huge group of people that are in Egypt, Moses has to try to convince the king to let them go. This is a very hard job, and it's not going to be easy, but he's going to have God with him. God is going to help him. God is going to tell him what to say. God is going to be the one to make them listen. God is going to send Aaron to go with him, and God is going to help him. So all Moses needs to do is to trust God and to obey God. And if he does that, then God will help him, and God will keep his promises to bring the Israelites out, to rescue them. Now I'm just going to sing you a song called Obedience, because it's very important for us to obey God. When we just trust and obey God, then God will help us too. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. Doing exactly what the Lord commands, doing it happily. Action is the key, do it immediately. Joy you will receive. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. O-B-E-D-I-E-N-C-E. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. We want to live pure, we want to live clean, we want to do our best, sweetly submitting to authority, leaving to God the rest, walking in the light, keeping our attitudes right, on the narrow way. For if you believe the word you receive, you always will obey. O-B-E-D-I-E-N-C-E. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. So that story about Moses is actually a very special story to me, because I heard a talk about that story when I was thinking about doing this radio program, and I believe that God wanted me to do it, and I felt very much like Moses. There were a lot of reasons why I didn't think I was the right person to do it. I'm not good at talking either, but this story was very helpful to me to just obey and just trust God to help me, and He has every time. But let's talk about Hudson Taylor. So I know Hudson Taylor, or I know the story of Hudson Taylor as somebody who went to China as a missionary. So he spent 51 years of his life in China as a missionary. But we want to talk about before he goes. So like just as we talked about Moses, about God calling him, we're going to talk about Hudson Taylor before he goes to China. So Hudson's dad actually wanted to go to China. He really felt for the people there in China, but he was unable to go. So him and his wife prayed that they would have a child who would go to China since the dad couldn't go. And so they had Hudson Taylor, and he was born. And so they prayed that God would send this child to China when he grew up. But they didn't tell him that, which was wise. They never told him that until he was already in China. So Hudson Taylor was born in the 1800s. And as a child, when he was about 4 or 5, he actually said, I'm going to go to China when I grow up to be a missionary, because his family loved China and cared about the people of China. There were so many people there who didn't know about God and didn't know about Jesus. And so he would hear this as a child about China, and so that's why he said he wanted to go one day. But then when he became a teenager, he was not very interested in God anymore. He kind of became rebellious and was around people who didn't believe in God, and Hudson Taylor didn't really know what he believed anymore. And so his parents are starting to get worried about him. And his sister started praying for him, and she actually wrote in her journal, I'm going to pray every day for him to come to know God. I'm going to pray for him every day. Now, a month after this, Hudson Taylor didn't have much to do, and he was looking for something to read, and he saw some pamphlets, like tracts, and he thought, I'm going to read, because sometimes pamphlets have a story and then they have something to learn from the story. So he picked up one of these pamphlets and thought, I'm just going to read the story because the story will be the interesting part, and then I'm not going to bother to read the ending of it. So he started reading this story, but it so gripped him that he read the whole thing and he really started to think about it. And he ended up coming to know God through this little pamphlet he was reading. Now, what he didn't know is that while he was reading this pamphlet, his mother, she was away at the time, and she just felt so burdened for him. She so wanted to see him change and to really start to love and know God that she'd gone into her room and she'd gotten on her knees and she just started crying out to God and praying to God for Hudson. She even said she was going to pray until that he was changed. So she is in the room where she's staying. She is praying and praying for Hudson Taylor. Now, in the meantime, here he is picking up this tract, thinking he's just going to read this story and that's it. And he starts reading it, and he gets changed through reading this tract. And as his mum was praying, she suddenly had a peace that God had heard her prayer and that he had been changed. And so when she came home from her holiday, Hudson Taylor said, there's something I need to tell you, Mum. And she said, I think I already know. And so she already knew that Hudson Taylor had been changed. And so his sister, a month before, had started praying for him every day. And then his mother was praying for him right at the time when his heart was changed. So one of the big things I see, and actually most of the story of Hudson Taylor, even later on, is just that he had a God who hears prayer. He's real, and he answers prayer. And I'm going to sing you 2 songs about prayer. have a God who hears my prayers. I have a God who answers prayer. I have a God who sees and cares. My God answers prayer. I have a God who hears my prayers. I have a God who answers prayer. I have a God who sees and cares. My God answers prayer. Pray when you're happy, pray when you're sad, pray when you're good and when you've been bad. Pray when you're worried, pray when you're scared, pray to the God who cares. Pray when you're happy, pray when you're sad, pray when you're good and when you've been bad. Pray when you're worried, pray when you're scared, pray to the God who cares. So God had heard Hudson's parents' prayer that he would give them a child who would go to China as a missionary, because that's what he did for most of his life. And he also heard his mother's prayers and his sister's prayers for him, and his life had been changed. So now his heart is changed. Now he wants to live for God. He wants to know God and he wants to live for God. And after some time, he knows that God wants him to go to China. So just like God called Moses to go to Egypt, God has called Hudson Taylor to go to China. So now he's got to prepare. So one way of preparing is to read the Bible and to pray and to get to know God, because you can't go to be a missionary and tell people about God if you don't know God yourself. That's the most important thing, to know what you want to share with other people. But also he's going to study medicine, because if he's going to go to China, it would be very helpful for him to, be able to practically help the people. He also started learning Mandarin, the Chinese language. That would be very helpful. And he also became a medical assistant for a doctor. So he's preparing himself as much as he can. And he learns to trust in God more, to trust God to take care of him and to give him what he needs. So now he's living in a very poor neighborhood. He moved into a poor neighborhood. And he's also going to start by being a missionary at home. He doesn't just want to go over to China to help the people there. He's going to start by helping people in his own city. So he lived in England. So now he's living in a very poor neighborhood. So he starts by trying to help the people there. So he would go out and talk to people and try to help them and tell those people about Jesus as well. Now, so he doesn't have a whole lot of money. Now, one night, it's like at midnight, he's just getting ready to go to bed, and there's a knock at the door, and there's a man at the door, and he says, "Can you please come? Can you come help me? My wife is dying, and we need you." And so Hudson Taylor goes with him, but on the way he's thinking, does he really need help? Does he really have a sick wife, or is this just a trick? Is he trying to rob me? Now, Hudson Taylor felt in his pocket, and he had 1 coin left. That was all the money he had left. He had 1 coin. Now, it must have been worth a lot more than our coins. So maybe it'd be a bit, I don't know how much money it was worth, but it'd be a bit like having a note, like a $20 note or a $50 note. So he's got that in his pocket, and that's all he's got. So he goes to these people's house, and it's very, very poor. They don't even have furniture. The lady's just kind of, doesn't even have a proper bed to lay on, and she looks very sick, and she's got a new baby. And there are other children there, and they're all hungry. They haven't even got food. And so this man says to him, "Will you please help us?" Now, Hudson Taylor is feeling his money in his pocket, and he thinks, "Oh, if only I had 2 coins. I've only got 1 coin. I can't give away all my money, can I? Does God really expect me to do that? If I just have 2 coins, I could give them 1, and I could keep 1. And so he starts to talk to this lady, and he starts to tell her about God and how she can trust God to help him. But then he thinks, how can I tell her about God? tell her about trusting God when I don't even want to trust God enough to give away my money to help them? And so he decided that he would give up the money he had in his pocket and he would give it to help this lady and her husband and their children. So he pulled it out and he gave it to them. He's giving them all the money that he has. And then he could tell them about God, because now he was trusting God himself. And he could tell them about his God who hears prayer and who forgives and who helps. And then he went back home. Now he's got empty pockets, but he has a full heart. He feels full of joy. He's trusting God. Now, back at home, he's got one meal left. So he goes back home in the morning. He wakes up. He has his last bowl of food. Now he's got to trust God to take care of him. But then the postman came with a package. And he opened it up. And inside was a pair of kids' gloves. And he thought, what on earth? And he picked them up. But as he picked them up, a coin fell out, just dropped out of the gloves. Now, this was a coin. This was worth way more than the other coin he had given up. And actually, when he had first come home, he read a verse in the Bible that says, if you have pity on the poor people, and if you give to them, you are lending to God, and God will give back what you have lent to him. And so now he could see that this verse really was true. He'd given his money and he was lending it to God, and God was paying him back. So this coin was worth way more than the money he'd given away. So now he had money to buy food. But another time he worked for this man, but this old man that he worked for as a medical assistant, he was very forgetful. And so sometimes he would forget to give Hudson his wages. And so he said to Hudson, if I forget, please tell me so that I can make sure I pay you. But Hudson thought, I want to learn to trust God for this. Instead of just asking the man, I want to pray to God and I want to see God answer my prayers, because he knew that when he was in China, he would really need to be able to trust God to hear him and answer his prayers and to take care of him. So he said, I am just going to pray to God and ask God to remind him. So this man, now he's forgotten again to pay Hudson Taylor, and Hudson needs that money to pay his rent. And the lady that he rents his home off is a poor widow lady, and so she really needs the money. And so it's coming time that he needs to pay this lady, and the doctor is still not remembered. But on Saturday night, as they were working, the doctor suddenly said to Hudson Taylor, have I paid you? And Hudson says, well, no, you're actually a bit behind and pay me. And he thought, oh, God has answered my prayer. God has reminded him. But then the doctor said, oh, you should have told me earlier. If you'd have told me earlier, I've just taken all my money to the bank, so now I've got no cash to give you. And Hudson thought, here's God answered his prayer and reminded the man, but now it's too late. He's got no cash. There's no way the man can pay him. They didn't have internet banking back then. And so the doctor goes home, and Hudson Taylor still stays on working. He doesn't want to go home because he's got no money to pay for his rent. So he thinks, I'm going to stay here until that lady has gone to bed. And he must feel a bit upset. Maybe he feels that God's failed him. I don't know. That's how I would feel. But anyway, later on, that the man that he works for comes back, and he comes in very excited. And he said, you won't believe it. I just had somebody banging on my door at home, and it was one of my richest customers. He came to pay his bill in cash at 10 o'clock at night on Saturday. And this doctor couldn't believe that this person would come at 10 o'clock in the night to pay him in cash to pay his bill. And so now that doctor had the cash in his hand, and he gave it to Hudson Taylor and said, this can be your pay. And so after all, Hudson was able to go home with the money in his hand and was able to pay that lady for his rent. So he learned through that you can trust God to take care of you. Sometimes you have to wait to the very last minute, but that was testing his faith. But he learned that you can trust God to take care of you, because he was going to need to be able to trust God in China. So he's learning while he's still in England to trust God. But there was another thing that happened. So he is studying medicine, he's working, and one day he got a little bit of a prick on his finger. And then he was, I think it was the next day, he was doing an autopsy on a man who died of a really bad fever. And he's got this prick in his finger. And not long after, he got very sick himself. And the doctor said, oh, you've got that fever, that terrible fever, and you are going to die. You need to get your things in order. You are not going to survive this. There is no hope for you. But Hudson said, but I know God wants me to be a missionary in China. I have to live. But the doctor said, I'm sorry, there's no way you're going to live. And so Hudson Taylor did get very, very sick. But he didn't die. He did recover, even though it took him a long time to recover. And then he found out that 2 other medical students had also got sick from that fever. And they both died. But Hudson Taylor didn't. Because God did have a job for him to do in China, and God was going to get him there. And so even that sickness, that horrible fever, didn't have power over him, because God was more powerful and God was in control. And so the doctor said to him, because the doctor knew that he was supposed to die from it and he didn't, and he could see Hudson Taylor's faith from the things he said. And the doctor said, I would give everything to have faith like you have. Such trust in a God which we cannot see and cannot hear. I have never seen anything like it. And Hudson said, you can have that faith. Everyone is allowed to believe in God. Everyone, no exceptions. Now this doctor, before this, he didn't want anything to do with religion or with God. But now, after seeing what had happened to Hudson and seeing his faith in God doing a miracle, now he wanted to hear. Now he was interested, and Hudson Taylor was able to tell this man about God and about trusting in God. So that's some of how Hudson Taylor ended up being a missionary in China. He obeyed God's call. He was obedient to God, just like Moses eventually was. So I'm going to sing one more song about prayer, and this song is called Whisper a Prayer in the Morning. Whisper a prayer in the morning. Whisper a prayer at noon. Whisper a prayer in the evening to keep your heart in tune. God answers prayer in the morning. God answers prayer at noon. God answers prayer in the evening to keep your heart in tune. So I hope you've enjoyed this story of Moses and how he learned to obey God and trust God, and the story of Hudson Taylor, who also learned to obey God and trust in God, and the wonder of a God who answers and hears our prayers. Pray that you may learn to trust him like Moses and Hudson Taylor did.